One thing that can undermine, if not destroy, Josh Heupel's offense is politically correctness. I'm going to explain that to you here momentarily. And it's brought to you by Bassey Lawn and Garden. Man alive, it's worth the drive. Bassey Lawn and Garden has the industrial and commercial mowers where you will want to get from Nashville, Knoxville, or Chattanooga to get to Cleveland, Tennessee, because their buying power will save you thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. The one thing that can destroy the type of offenses that we're seeing are an up-tempo offense. Obviously, I don't want this to ever happen because I enjoy these offenses, and I'm not to the point of being a football purist where I have to see the I formation and run it between the tackles every down. I'm not against that. I would like for some team to do that to see if it would work. The same way I'd like for the NBA to drop it down into the post like Kevin McHale style. And we almost saw Tennessee do that. They just didn't have the outside shooting in basketball. But the one thing would be, I think, politically correctness in that if there were some sort of tragedy to happen in which a player is going at such a high speed, and we will hear about this in August, Caleb. We will. A player in high school or college will pass away from heat exhaustion. It's happened at different schools. It tends to happen every year. But if people were to get on board that and say you need to slow the game down because you're asking too much of the human body, I think you can train the human body to do a lot of things. I don't think it's within one's nature to bench press 300 pounds. I don't think that's necessarily smart, good for your joints, but I've done it. So you can train the human body to do a lot of things. I'm not saying I agree with it if that were to ever come about, but that's the only thing I could see possibly undermining these types of offense that we're seeing now. But then you would have to turn to basketball and say, do you not play an up and down style? But you've had deaths in basketball too. The other thing I think is the RPO rules where you're allowed to block downfield on a passing play, which technically you're not supposed to be able to do. That's not how football was developed. You're supposed to send a clear signal whether or not it's a running play or a passing play. But those are the only two things that I could see possibly sidetracking these up-tempo offenses. I don't think it's going to happen, but you brought up the question. You're a little bit too young to remember this, but the run and shoot was phenomenal. And Warren Moon was one of the most accurate, best passers that we don't talk about on a day-to-day basis. He was absolute. Where he would put balls was unbelievable, but it did get figured out. And I guess there's a possibility of that. I don't see that right now with the up-tempo offenses, and I tend to agree with Tom. It's a sissification of society, and I don't want to see that. But that's the because I gave it a lot of thought because we were actually going to this topic yesterday, and I gave it a whole lot of thought last night and this morning. And that's really the only thing I could think of because college football would have to change the RPO rules where you can get linemen downfield on a passing play. And that would just be stupid because it's working and everybody enjoys it. Caleb, do you have anything as far as figured out?
Yeah, I got a way to figure it out. Funny enough, without
Maybe
changing
you
the rules.
shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't say it because I feel certain that Nick Saban's watching as we speak.
Well, I don't know if Nick Saban will be able to do this in time, but so for context, guys, if you go to 247 Sports by Brad Crawford, we're doing this segment because he named Josh Heupel, predicted that Josh Heupel would be a top 10 coach by next year, and I think you and I agree he's already top 10, probably as of right now.
Top 10 in the
And
nation. If not
yes,
top 10, then knocking on the door at 14 at the lowest if we really wanted to do a list.
yeah, exactly. And so last year's Georgia game, there were two things that happened that hurt Tennessee. Georgia's defensive backs were so good that they could hang with Tennessee down the field one-on-one. And the rain slowed them down. So when I realized the rain slowed them down, here's what I realized. Coaches should, or Do you remember? You probably remember this, Dave. 1990, when Steve Spurrier took out the artificial turf for Florida and put in natural grass because he realized that was more conducive to the offense he was running.
Yes.
And yeah, that was common throughout where people would change their grass structure. Let the grass grow a little bit on your football field. Let the grass grow a little bit on your football field. That'll slow down some of the speed that the receivers have on the outside. And then people will put all their effort into recruiting elite athletes at cornerback to be able to hang with the receivers. I think that's how you figure out this offense. Put down a grass that's not as conducive to speed.
Our high school used to turn the heat up for basketball games because our rival liked to play up tempo, and we were a slow basketball team. We were a half court team. So basically, what you're saying is the same thing. But I don't know that you could, everybody's playing slower there. And yeah, if I'm taking, let's say, Jalen Hyatt last year, he may be a little bit slower out of his breaks, but the defensive backs are slower out of their breaks too. So typically, I think a muddy field actually helps the receivers. And I think it would be the same thing for a grass field, wouldn't it?
I don't know. Okay, so if you remember the Peyton Manning Colts here, is Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne were very finesse receivers and speed receivers, and the reason they would lose to New England in the winter is New England would purposely not clear off the field during these snowstorms, and that always favored Ty Law and Asante Samuel, who were guarding Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne at the time. I mean, they just shut them down, and they couldn't get off bump and run coverage. I think maybe you're right that it favors the receivers because the defensive backs have to backpedal, but I think it favors defensive backs who like to play. If you like to play a physical bump and run, I think I think a muddy field favors the defensive backs at that point because you knock a receiver off the route, then there comes an issue. And by the time they may get back on that right route, the quarterback may be sacked. And I mean, so timing doesn't matter in Heupel's offense as it does in other offenses, but it does matter. I mean, timing, you can't undersell the importance of that.
Timing matters, but it seems like the reads on the safeties that they're oftentimes bare. So I don't think it matters as much as, let's say, a West Coast offense. Is that fair to say? I mean, if
Yes.
your timing's off in a West Coast offense, it's a long day at the office. And I would rather be proactive. I'd rather be the receiver making that cut to put the safety in a bad position or the cornerback in a bad position to be reactive and have to wait and then see what he's going to do. Also, specifically with the Georgia game last year, I think Georgia was a better football team. I think the things leading up to that were also not great for Tennessee. They had gotten the number 1 ranking. There was a lot of reason for Georgia to focus on practice and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That's where I think that pre-hype stuff factors in. I don't think they were going to overlook Tennessee. And I think the crowd was insulted by a lot of people, including former Tennessee quarterback Eric Ainge, who said it wasn't a tough place to play. Well, he was right 15 years ago. It wasn't an incredibly tough place to play. I mean, they've changed that place so much. It is a tough place to play right now. So to me, I don't think the long grass would necessarily do it, as devious and as mean as that is. People are saying on the message board, but
and let's also point out they should have started Brew McCoy and Ramel Keaton. Cedric Tillman shouldn't have started that game. He wasn't fast enough to get past those Georgia defensive backs because of his injury.
No, that's true. And I'll add this too. The reason I'm not as concerned, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend to tell you that I watched all of Southern California's games last year, or I watched more of TCU, but I will say this. I think the fact that Josh Heupel is dedicated to running the football could overcome a lot of these things. And the reason Josh Heupel's offense may be figured out, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now because of a point you made up months ago, Caleb. Josh Heupel's not going to be figured out. He adjusted his approach from his Oklahoma days. So if Josh Heupel, I mean, it's late in the year now. We're looking at the end of June. But if Josh Heupel looked down and he said, that I formation, it's coming back. And they've made rule changes where it's going to be run the football, control the clock. I do not. I know he's a former quarterback. I know he likes probably being called an offensive guru. Caleb, I don't think he would hesitate for a second to shift gears and do something that he's not completely comfortable with if he thought it gave him the best chance to win. The same thing with Philip Fulmer. I go back to that James Banks game at Georgia. I thought it was one of the best games he ever coached. The same thing at Miami when they ran the ball and slowed it down, played deep secondary. I think coaches ultimately want to win, and you can love running or throwing the football, but I think both of those guys are smart enough where they wouldn't let that get in their way of winning the football game. And I think Josh Heupel, if somebody told him, you're going to win 2 national championships with an I formation, like he had a voice from God tell him that in the middle of the night, you would see Tennessee run an I formation headed into not this year, but next year.
Well, okay, yeah. If we're asking about Josh Heupel, I agree with you.
Which is a different question. I kind of changed it up.
You're right, a different question. So what we're talking right now is Josh Heupel's offense, because an example of what you just brought up, that's Steve Spurrier. His fun and gun was figured out. I mean, you brought up that Chavis told you that he thought Spurrier had been figured out by like 1998, and we heard Fred White talk to us last weekend that as he got older, people kind of understood that Spurrier's fun and gun was about throwing it to a spot. So if you remember, Florida scoring precipitously dropped as they played Tennessee the past few years when Spurrier was there. But Spurrier then went to South Carolina and was like, okay, I can use Connor Shaw or whoever you have at quarterback at that time, and I can be a little bit more of a run-oriented team, and I can use elite running backs like Marcus Lattimore, talk about a guy who deserved NIL money. And he went that route. And so I agree. I think Josh Heupel is that way. He's not fully committed to a system, whether or not it works. The only thing I want to push back on, Dave, is so Heupel's system, we agree, is still very dependent right now. The system, receivers have to be fast enough to get there in the secondary, right? They do have to have a certain amount of speed. Okay. And don't you think that Georgia, you're right, was the better football team because they have cornerbacks that can match that speed? I just think teams are going to start recruiting more heavily for cornerbacks. And maybe they might start putting their best, the old adage that players play cornerbacks because they can't catch. And maybe you might have to start putting your fastest players at cornerback so they can hang with these guys down the field. And that might be how you switch it. And I also want to ask you.
But you're still the reactive guy. On defense, in the secondary, you're reactive. And I'd rather be the active guy as opposed to the reactive guy. I think you're more likely to get slowed that way.
As more people run this offense, more high schools and middle schools will start coaching guys to be reactive a little bit better. So you'll see adjustments at the cornerback position where maybe you'll and then in 10 years, we'll have a golden age of elite cornerbacks. Look at Tennessee. We talk about how bad Tennessee secondary was last year, but the year before they churned out a second-round draft pick in Alontae Taylor. I don't think Alontae Taylor is a second-round draft pick if he's not going up against Josh Heupel's offense every day in practice, which made him so much better.
That's true. I think that this offense has come up from high school instead of vice versa. I think this offense has evolved. I mean, I've got a buddy who's an offensive coordinator at a big school in Knoxville, and he was running some similar things literally 20 years ago. Caleb, I know that sounds crazy, but I think a lot of this stuff gets kind of figured out at the high school level where the stakes aren't as high, and then it moves up. The grand exception is Hal Mumme, who he coached his goofy offense, and every school in Kentucky still to this day runs it. Why? I don't know. But I just don't see it getting figured out. I understand what you're saying about the long grass. To me, that helps the players more on offense.
Do you not agree that the rain helped Georgia last year more than Tennessee?
Yeah, but I don't think there's anything you can do about that. I think the rain would hurt the West Coast offense. I think that, if Tennessee's going to face 12 rainy days this season, I think it's a long season.
That's what I'm saying, though. If the elements slow you down, you're saying it favors the receivers, but you could make the grass the elements where you kind of – what you're saying is if the game slows down, it favors the receivers because it's harder for the cornerbacks to react, whether that be high grass or rain or whatever. Well, the cornerbacks with Georgia, it seemed like it was favoring them when they were playing Tennessee last year.
I would say this. I think of the list of factors in that Georgia game, that rain would have been about fifth. I think it was Georgia's a better football team overall, right? I think second is they felt disrespected, which everybody tries to make their team feel disrespected, but they did because of the number one ranking. I think the crowd felt disrespected, and I could probably come up with two or three others. Stetson Bennett played lights out. And then I think the rain was further down the list maybe than you. Maybe that's the common ground there.
Okay, fine. But I'm just saying theoretically, based on your logic, it shouldn't have even been a factor. It should have actually helped Tennessee.
Right. So ideally, your best offense, which I think Josh Heupel is working towards and closer than we think, is you can go out there. Well, they did that. I mean, against Pitt, and there was another team that they ran for more than they threw. I think maybe you're not giving Josh Heupel enough credit for having a solid ground game.
Oh no, I think he has an amazing ground game, but his ground game is what makes the whole offense go. But I think the passing game, it's the wide splits that's such a factor. The wide splits don't work without the solid ground game. I think we both agree with that. But if you got cornerbacks that are fast enough to hang with the receivers down the field, then the nickel and the safety don't have to guess whether or not Heupel's going to run the ball. Then they can just crowd the box to stop the run at that point.
Very true, but if you got a guy like Jalen Hyatt or Tillman or even Ramel Keaton, who I'm not as high on as most people, but if you have those guys, then you burn them over the top. I would think that would be your answer.